Good morning, everyone. My name is Vincent Pan. I'm the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action. I also serve on the board of the Campaign for College Opportunity. It's great to see all of you here today for the release of the campaign's State of Higher Education for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Californians report. Before we start, I want to go over quickly some housekeeping items. First of all, as you all should have been notified upon joining, this webinar will be recorded and will be shared in the coming days. Second, later in the program, we will have audience question and answer. So please be sure to drop in your questions into the chat and we'll make sure that we'll be able to answer those questions live. And lastly, I want to encourage all of you to download and read the report. The link to the report will also be placed in the chat. And we do encourage you to read it at your leisure after this webinar. Before introducing our fearless leader, Michelle Sequeiros, I just wanted to say why this report is so important to the campaign and also to the community. As all of you all know, this is the last day of Nhpi Heritage Month, and it's a moment for us not just to celebrate the unique contributions of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, but also to address our unique challenges and to be in solidarity with all those pushing and fighting for a more equitable and just society. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders face a range of issues, and in many cases, they are the same issues that all Americans face, including access and equity in our educational systems. And so this report follows a long tradition of the campaign trying to lift up communities that have often been invisible or marginalized to make sure that our public policy addresses our unique needs, our special challenges, and brings all communities together in a way that ensures equity for all. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Sequeiros, our leader at the Campaign for College Opportunity. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Vin, for joining us, for your leadership in this work, for always advocating for all of our communities, and for being such a strong and important leader on the Campaign for College Opportunity. Good morning, everyone. I'm truly honored to be with you here to release this important report. As many of you are familiar with the mission of the Campaign for College Opportunity, our focus continues to be very much on ensuring greater access to college opportunity and equitable success once our students get into college in terms of their outcomes. And we work very hard towards that mission. And as many of you know, we don't just raise attention to important data and issues in higher education. We're very much focused on making sure that we solve for the problems that affect higher education. And you simply can't solve for those problems unless you have good data and unless the data goes very deep. We have a very strong belief in equity for all in California, and the state of higher education for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders in California is an example. That this research is an example of not just the importance of 7 million of our fellow Californians who are Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, but it really is to elevate, most importantly, how we can disaggregate the data. I've been thinking a lot about why this report in particular is so important. And part of the reason is that, we are all harmed when stereotypes are laid upon any one of our communities. We know that a stereotype can be mostly negative and not speak to the full truth that we are as full human beings and full Californians. But we also know that even positive stereotypes like the model minority myth that is pervasively laid upon Asian Americans in our society can actually be incredibly harmful when it fails to look at the different and very real experiences that every single member of our community faces. Chinese American Californians, Indian American Californians, Hmong Californians. And we see in this report huge variation across all the different ethnic groups. You're going to get an incredible preview of some of the highlights of this report. It's really been a labor of love from a team that has been phenomenal. But I would love to thank our exceptional reviewers, Dr. Mike Wen, Dr. Robert Teranashi, Dr. Sirian Villavicencio, Dr. Janelle Wong, and Golia Yang, as well as the UC Office of the President, the Cal State Chancellor's Office, and the Community Colleges of California, their Chancellor's Office, for providing us with good, thoughtful reviews of the data and the report, the information that we needed to present this to you. Before I pass it on to our stellar team here at the campaign, I want today to really be in honor of all the many rich contributions. You're going to get a profile into some of the key findings, but this report is filled with the complicated and rich history and contributions of Asian Americans in California. And it really is an effort to address and honor not just the rich heritage and contributions that Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders have made to our state, but also in the hopes that with greater understanding and more thoughtful data, we will stop Asian hate across this country, that we will honor the victims that were attacked in Laguna Woods simply by nature of their ethnicity, and that we will strive towards a more perfect union. I am incredibly grateful to introduce my team, Dr. Vikash Reddy. He's our Senior Director of Policy Research. Without him, this work would not have happened. And our research fellow, Doug Lee, a future doctor in the making who has given his love to this project so that you can have it in front of you. So thank you all for joining us today. And I don't want to forget to also honor and thank our artist who designed the cover for this report, the images that you'll see throughout this presentation, Susan Chen. So Vikash, passing it to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, not just for your generous introduction, but also for your co-authorship on this report. And I also want to, before I dive into my presentation, add my thanks to those that Michelle has already expressed, to our co-author, Doug Lee, and also to our research team, David Salmon, Stephanie Sowell, and Brianna Ramirez, for their excellent contributions to this report. Would not have been possible without you. Also to our review team, really do appreciate the insightful but actionable feedback that you all provided. And to the UC and CSU and California community colleges, the representatives from your various leadership offices and data teams who were helpful with the data retrieval and analysis, as well as the review and final revisions for this report. As has already been mentioned, we invite you to download this report from our website, collegecampaign.org. Follow along today with our social media handle at CollegeOp, and our hashtags today are Nhpi and Higher Ed and Disaggregate the Data. So California, as we've already heard, is home to over 7 million Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Californians. There are large proportions here in Orange County, Los Angeles County, and San Diego County for Asian Americans, as well as up north in the Bay Area. Those same 3 counties in the south are home to large populations of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. Again, we see, though, in different counties in the Bay Area, high percentages of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders there too. Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders over the last decade have been among the fastest growing groups in California. And right now actually stand at the 2nd largest ethnic group in the state. Ethnic minority group, I should say, in the state. With this size and increased size has come increased political influence and power. I'm citing an article here from the Los Angeles Times recently, to discussing the increased political influence of Asian Americans in the LA mayoral race. You can find similar articles about Asian Americans and NHPIs in statewide races. And of course, we all know that the nation's first vice president in the United States of South Asian descent comes from right here in California, Vice President Kamala Harris. But listening to me for the last few minutes and hearing about the contributions of Asian Americans and have been numerous to the state might feed into what we've heard discussed as the model minority myth already. The truth is that the Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community is incredibly diverse, hailing from 48 different ethnicities and backgrounds as counted by the census, tens of thousands of islands across the Pacific. The community colleges, the UC and the CSU report data on over 30 different sub-ethnicities within the Asian American and NHPI demographics. And we know that investigating that data more carefully is critical to better understanding these populations. This slide shows the bachelor's degree attainment for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders as well as Asian Americans, both in their overall, which you can see in the slightly bolder text and font, as well as for various subgroups. Now, comparing the most recent data from US Census, the 2020 5-year estimates to those from 5 years ago, we see broadly upward trends, and we see upward trends among almost every single sub-ethnicity within the larger Asian American and NHPI populations. Indeed, almost 6 out of 10 Asian Americans have a bachelor's degree or higher. That's only 2 out of 10 Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So right here on this slide, we see the immense importance of disaggregating the data and showing by sub-ethnicity and subgroup within these diverse populations, educational outcomes and attainment. A note before we get into the data on education attainment and outcomes for California's Asian Americans and NHPI students, I just want to talk a little bit about the data. We have to draw on several data sources to produce this report, each of these with their own advantages and challenges. I've already mentioned the United States Census, which is a rich source of information on sub-ethnicities that includes employment information, educational outcomes and attainment, but doesn't tell us as much about educational success and graduation rates and things like that. For that, we turn to the National Center for Education Statistics as one of our primary resources. They maintain several databases. One of these is called IPEDS, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Database. Or data system, I think, actually. This particular system has a lot of information about enrollment, success, re-enrollment, degree production. It has information about campus finances, campus faculty, all sorts of information. But when we look within the racial and ethnic categories, they only disaggregate as far as Asian American and NHPI, which, as I've already noted, is a tremendous limitation of much of the data that we've seen about education and educational outcomes. On a state level, we look at 4 different places. The California Department of Education gives us information about graduation outcomes, A through G outcomes, and other high school, or K through 12, I should say, related educational outcomes. This particular database on their public-facing data systems includes only Asian Americans, Filipinos, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. While the department does collect finer grain data that's available to researchers by request, in the production of this report, that particular data system or data request process had been suspended pending some sort of review or overhaul, so we didn't have access to finer grain data beyond the 3 categories I just mentioned. The California community colleges have a similar public-facing data architecture that includes disaggregation down to an Asian American, Filipino, and NHPI level. This system also maintains finer grain data. We are grateful to the California community colleges for providing us with the student level data that allowed us to look at a lot of the outcomes and education questions that we had related to community college students in this report. The CSU and the UC both have public dashboards and databases that include fine-grained data on sub-ethnicities within both the Asian American and NHPI communities. One thing that I will note for the data that we use for this report is that for first-year freshmen, Cal State data is current through students enrolling in the fall of 2017. UC data only goes as far as students enrolling in 2015. So where are California's Asian Americans and NHPI students enrolled? This particular graph shows us that relative to California as a whole, the California community colleges enroll slightly fewer Asian American and NHPI students, but they still enroll the majority of the populations. 59% of each of these populations, Asian American and NHPIs, attend a California community college campus. Among Asian Americans, we do see a large enrollment in the UC system. 15% for Asian Americans in the state are enrolled in the UC. This compares to 7% of the overall population and just 4% of the NHPI population. The Cal State enrollment numbers are similar to the statewide. For Asian Americans, 16% enrolled in the Cal State, meanwhile 10% enrolled in a Cal State for NHPIs. We also note, however, that private for-profit institutions enroll 18%. That's almost 1 out of 5 Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Californians. So we want to make sure we understand why that is. That's relative to a 7% overall, so we're definitely overrepresented in that sector. And we talk a little bit more about why that might concern us in the report. Now, turning to the primary enroller of Asian American students and NHPI students, the California community colleges, one thing that we want to celebrate is the success of placement reforms originally introduced with AB 705 a few years ago. These reforms entitled students to the right to enroll in transfer level coursework when they enrolled in the community college. And as a result, more students than ever before are taking and passing transfer level English and math. Most recently in the 2019-2020 year, among Asian Americans, 87% of students enrolled directly into transfer level coursework without first taking a remedial course or a pre-transfer level course. And 83% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Californians enrolled directly into a transfer level course without first taking a remedial course on after enrollment. We think these numbers are worthy of celebration, and we hope that they get further towards ensuring that all students are enrolling in transfer level coursework directly. We know this is important because prior research has shown us that students who enroll first in remedial coursework are less likely to graduate, less likely to earn their credential, and less likely to transfer. Speaking of graduation and transfer, graduation rates for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students are roughly on average similar to their peers. Among Asian American students, 15% of students enrolling in 2013-14 and earn their degree or credential within 6 years, compared to an overall average of 14%. Among Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, however, this was just 11%. We see, however, on this graph, again, tremendous variation in the number of students from within each ethnicity who are graduating at various stages. Among Vietnamese students, 1 in 5 earned their degree or credential within 6 years. Among Samoan students, Hawaiian students, and Laotian students, it was closer to 1 in 10. Among transfers, similarly, we see tremendous success for Asian American students relatively to the average California community colleges average. Again, among students enrolling in 2013-14, we see that among all students, 28% transferred to a 4-year a 4-year institution within 6 years. Among Asian American students, that's 38%. Among NHPI students, 22%. Again, a tremendous spread for around 1 in 5 Hawaiian and Samoan students, Laotian students transferring within 6 years. Closer to 2 in 5 Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese, and Korean students doing so within 6 years. Turning to students enrolling directly at a Cal State or a UC, we see, and for the most part, positive trend lines in the graduation rates for Asian American and NHPI students, particularly at the Cal States, though we note something of a gap between NHPI students enrolling as freshmen and their Asian counterparts. At the UC, the trend lines for Asian Americans certainly have been up at the 4-year marks. We note, however, that graduation rates for students enrolling as freshmen and NHPI students enrolling as freshmen have been flat or potentially even falling. We do understand and note that small sample sizes will lead to some variation year to year, but again, the trend line is not quite what we would hope to see. Digging in on the detail again with the Cal States, in terms of a 4 to 6 year graduation rates for students entering as freshmen, we see tremendous variation. So between over 8 and 10 Malaysian, Japanese, Chinese, and Sri Lankan students graduating within 6 years of their initial enrollment, compared to more like 15% of Tongan students, about a third of Samoan students, and around half of Hmong students. At the UC, similar variation, though generally higher rates, but the 6 year graduation rates for Asian American and NHPI students range from 50% on the lower end to over 90, 94% on the higher end. We were looking at transfer students coming out of the California community colleges a minute ago. If we look at the transfer students enrolling at the CSUs and the UCs, again, at the Cal States, positive trend lines in the graduation rates for both Asian Americans and NHPI transfer students enrolling in terms of the 2 year and 4 year graduation rates. At the UCs, we see some positive signs of growth. Again, however, the trend lines in particular for NHPI students, not quite what we're hoping to see. And here too, similarly, among students at the CSU, transfer students, tremendous variation within various communities, or among the various communities, I should say. Now, again, we know small sample sizes might lead to some wonkiness, but you know, when the range is 50% to between 50% to 100%, you know, that's substantial variation. Again, evident at the UC. I'll note, I guess, that the Cal States published data on their transfer students at the 4 year and 6 year marks, and so that's what we've produced here. That will look slightly different to the graph that we have for the UC, and so just bear that in mind. But again, similar story emerges, that there is just tremendous variation in the number of students graduating at various time markers among the various Asian American and NHPI populations. At this point, I'd like to introduce our research fellow, Doug Lee, my co-author on this report. He's going to talk to us about the need for a welcoming and inviting campus, and various elements that go into it. Doug?
Thank you, Vikash. So in terms of research has shown the importance of representation to the well-being and success of minoritized students. For Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, representation is not seen amongst the key decision makers in the governing boards in California public higher education. This also extends to the classroom. In our analysis of faculty data, we find that in all 3 systems of public higher education in California, that there are more than 5 times the number of Asian American students per Asian American faculty member, and almost 10 times the number of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students per Native Hawaiian faculty member as compared to their white counterparts. Representation in the classroom is important, and a more robust effort to recruit and retain Nhpi faculty is vital to the success of Nhpi students. Nhpi stands for the Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Serving Institutions, and is the newest federal designation of minority serving institutions. To be eligible to be an Nhpi, schools must serve a 10% Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander population and meet certain criteria as outlined in Section 312B of the Higher Education Act, such as financial need and Pell Grant eligibility. In total, 166 schools are eligible for Nhpi grants, and 68 schools are in the state of California. This means that in California, over 60% of Asian American students and nearly 50% of all Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders students are at schools eligible for additional financial assistance from the federal government to help fund programs that serve the Nhpi community. Included with that number, an additional 48 schools, which includes more private universities and the rest of the UC system, are potentially eligible for this program and can do so by applying for the designation and or requesting waivers over certain requirements. There are currently 10 Nhpi eligible schools in California since 2020 that have received a grant. One of these grants is the SAC project, a partnership between the Sacramento State and the Los Rios Community College District that focuses on improving transfer and completion rates of Nhpi transfer students. CSU Long Beach started Project Resilience in the wake of anti-Asian hate and discrimination and focuses on wellness and mental health support, as well as academic support through learning communities. Overall, the Nhpi program is a great start to helping schools focus their attention on the needs of Nhpi students. And more equitable funding for the program will definitely help future Nhpi schools and its students. So with this in mind and thinking about how colleges and universities can better serve Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students, I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Leila Tamale, who will speak more about her experience as one. Leila is a community organizer and a student at the College of San Mateo's Mana Learning Community. So please help me welcome Leila.
Thank you so much, Doug. And I'd like to express my gratitude to the campaign for all of the incredibly important work that you all do and for inviting me to speak and share my story today. It's definitely an honor. So good morning, everyone. My name is Leila Tamale. I am Tongan, Samoan, Fijian, and French, and I just graduated from the College of San Mateo, where I studied ethnic studies and political science. As Doug mentioned, I am a student, or I guess now alumni, of the Mana Learning Community, which is a student support program designed to increase the rates of retention and graduation of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders at CSM. So taking it back a few years and about why I decided to go to community college, it actually wasn't what I envisioned for myself initially. I went to a fairly competitive high school in the Bay Area, and community college was heavily stigmatized. You know, you have students applying to places like Harvard and Yale and UPenn, and there was definitely this misconception pushed out and normalized that people who went to community college were less than. And then COVID hit, and my family was faced by a large amount of financial difficulties, and my mom didn't have work, and there was just so much going around, so much uncertainty and instability that I decided you know, it doesn't really make sense to pay all of this tuition money to do college from my bedroom. And so I decided to save money and enroll at CSM. And in researching all of the programs and offerings that CSM had, I discovered the Mana Learning Community. And I decided to join them because I was really seeking out community with people that looked like me and could understand a lot of the experiences that I had dealt with growing up in a severely colonial and discriminatory Western education system. And I also wanted to reconnect to my Pacific Islander heritage as someone who is of mixed race. And my worries of, you know, not being fully accepted as someone who isn't full, quote unquote, Pacific Islander, those worries were immediately displaced. I was instantly welcomed into such a loving, welcoming family. And all of my experiences in Mana were incredibly positive and fulfilling. It was where I was first introduced to brilliant scholars of Pacifica or Pacific Islander ancestry. Before becoming part of Mana, I never even knew that our people were in these spaces of academia as professors, as doctors, etc. I was able to work with a dedicated counselor who was Pacific Islander and could relate to a lot of the struggles that I dealt with. And I also learned about Oceanian cultures, histories, and other Indigenous Pacifica epistemologies in our Mana faculty taught Oceania Studies courses. And Oceania Studies and Ethnic Studies, as indicated by my major, is now my academic and my lifelong passion. And my mentors at Mana, including the coordinator, Dr. Finausina Tovo, connected me with various other Pacifica scholars, research opportunities, and organizations such as Empowering Pacific Islander Communities and the Tonga Research Association. And this was really important to me I was actually given the chance to advance my leadership skills as well in leadership development courses, as well as by taking on leadership roles in our student organizations, such as Vakatasi Pacifica, and really solidify my passion for community empowerment work. Overall, at the end of the day, I am so incredibly thankful that community college is where I ended up, and not only saved my family a large sum of money, but most importantly, it gave me the opportunities to really discover my academic passions in ethnic studies, build lifelong relationships, and grow as a leader, scholar, and individual in general. And without CSM and without MANA, I wouldn't have been accepted for transfer into Stanford University, nor would I have been invited to serve on the California Commission on API Affairs, Higher Education Committee Advisory Body, which led me to being here with you all today. And right now, MANA is only at a handful of community colleges in California. And I truly believe that MANA or other Pacifica serving programs need to be at more of these schools, especially those with larger NHPI student populations, because it's with the support that these programs that are made by and for Pacifica students provide, us Pacifica youth can feel and truly realize that we belong in spaces of higher education, in college, and can figure out how to navigate higher ed successfully. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Layla, for sharing your story. You know, I often spend a lot of time with data, numbers, and writing reports. And so I think it's incredibly important for all of us to have a reminder of the students about whom we're writing and for whom we're doing this work. So I do appreciate you taking the time to be with us this morning and for sharing your story. I want to pick up on a theme that Layla shared in her story, and I think it's one that this conversation certainly isn't complete unless we're talking about the impact of COVID-19 on our students, on our campuses, on our colleges, universities, and really on our whole state, the state of California. This pandemic has had enormous impacts on all of us, but Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders here in the state have felt some of these impacts in different ways than their California peers. We know that on a health impact, this one has been devastating to all of our communities. But it's important on health, just as it is in education, to disaggregate this data and understand, to try to figure out why, for example, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders have higher mortality rates among those infected than their peers. So whether it's infection rates, mortality rates, vaccination rates, this disaggregation is important. Similarly, on enrollment, we know that the pandemic has had tremendous impacts on enrollment for all students across the board. Now, we are grateful and we are proud that Asian American and NHPI students enrolling in four-year universities, the Cal States and the UCs, in California haven't seen substantial and significant declines in enrollment and have actually stayed steady, or perhaps even grown by a percentage or two. At the community college level, that's not the case. We've seen year over year consistent declines and concerning declines, and ones that we know we have to focus attention on, ensuring that we're engaging students who would be going to community college and re-engaging students who maybe have stopped out. On enrollment, or I beg your pardon, on employment as well, we know that Asian Americans seem to have been hit by longer term unemployment at rates higher than their peers in the state. And so ensuring that we're addressing that, supporting Asian Americans in the state through this crisis is critical. And on a safety front, we've seen over the last 2 years more than a 5-fold increase in the number of hate and bias crimes reported against Asian Americans and NHPIs in California. This is due in part to misinformation, misconceptions, and misperceptions about the nature of the COVID-19 pandemic. But whatever the cause, it's a cause for concern and alarm. And too many of these crimes are happening on college campuses. So whether it's on campus or off campus, we have to do everything we can to support Asian Americans and NHPIs and keep them safe and ensure safe learning environments for all of our students. Thinking just a little bit outside of the educational outcomes data, but about factors that we know are related to education and educational success, The report has a section on barriers to success for Asian Americans and NHPIs in California that I would urge you all to read in greater detail. I do want to talk just a little bit about some of these, including rates of poverty, language proficiency, first-generation status, and immigration status that are highly relevant to California's Asian American and NHPI populations. While overall poverty rates are around 10 to 13% for Asian American and NHPI Californians respectively, we know here too that there's tremendous variation in the rates of poverty experienced by Asian Americans and NHPIs depending on demographic subgroup. And when we look at child poverty, for example, we see that over a third of Mongolian children, Marshallese children, and Hmong children are growing up in families that are classified as being in poverty. And poverty, just remember, is about $26,000 for a family of 4. So not that much for the state of California. And these numbers translate to financial assistance and the need for financial assistance for students attending our colleges and universities. For example, 8 out of 10 Hmong students attending a CSU is receiving a Pell Grant, whereas roughly around 1 in 10 Japanese students is receiving a Pell Grant. So we see tremendous variation in the financial needs of students attending our colleges and universities. We need to make sure that we have financial programs and assistance that will help them make that college dream a reality. On the language proficiency front, we know that roughly, according to the US Census, a third of Asian Americans and NHPIs in California are English language proficient. That means that they speak English less than very well on a 5-point scale, so a 3, 2, or a 1 on a 5-point scale. And again, here too, we see variation within communities, with roughly half of Vietnamese, Burmese, Thai, Chinese, Korean, and Mongolian Californians reporting limited English proficiency for the US Census. Similarly, and noting, if we think back to a slide I shared at the beginning of my presentation with variation in rates of BA attainment or bachelor's degree attainment among Asian Americans, you can imagine that populations that have lower degrees of bachelor's degree attainment do have higher degree of first-generation college attendance at our 4-year universities. So ensuring that we have ways to support these populations in places where they need it is a critical piece of what we have to do moving forward. And finally, thinking about immigration status, roughly 10% of potentially eligible DACA recipients in the US have an Asian background or an Asian background. And in California, around 20% of California's undocumented population comes from an Asian country. So thinking about how we support undocumented students in their access to higher education is a really important question when we think about Asian Americans and NHPIs here in California. So what do we think we should do about it? Well, this is not an exhaustive list of policy recommendations, but these are some of the ones that out of the data that we've looked at think make a lot of sense for California. On a K-12 level, supporting students to A through G completion alongside graduation, and in fact, making the A through G curriculum a part of the graduation requirements. When students graduate from a California high school, they should be ready to attend a 4-year college or university within the state directly. And while the community college is a great option for all of our students, that access should be part and parcel of the high school diploma. Additionally, ensuring that all students are completing a FAFSA or a California DREAM Act application is another critical component of making sure that students who are looking at college or university decisions have all the information they need to make sure they can achieve their college potential. And as we've already noted, a high population of California's Asian American and NHPI populations have limited English proficiency. So making sure that we're supporting English language learners in our K-12 schools is a critical component to ensuring college success for Asian American and NHPI Californians. At the college and university level, if supporting students through what has been a brutal pandemic, not just as I've mentioned already on the health and the employment and the enrollment side, but on the safety side. Making sure our colleges and universities are welcoming and safe spaces, and making sure that students have the resources to navigate this difficult period where courses have been transitioning to and from an online environment, and supporting them to succeed even as the world around them has been a little bit crazy. doubling down on equitable placement reforms that have increased access to transfer level coursework for students across the board, and supporting students to complete their certificate or their degree, including supporting students onto the associate degree for transfer pathways. The ADT, as we know from previous research, is saving students time and money en route to transfer and en route to achieving their bachelor's degree goals. Finally, for campuses that have Nhpi eligibility, applying for Nhpi grants and creating programs for Asian American NHPI students and on their campuses to support these students who are making decisions about transfer and graduation and better support their students all around. And finally, ensuring a diverse faculty that reflects the diverse student body, as well as an administration and leadership at a campus level that looks like the students and state of California. At a state level, making sure that a 70% attainment goal applies not just to a state as a whole, but to our subgroups and subpopulations within the Asian American and NHPI populations, and supporting all of our students and all of our citizens to ensure that they have a bachelor's degree or a degree that will help them participate in the labor market, be that a certificate, associate degree, bachelor's degree, or beyond. Ensuring that the cradle to career data system has a robust and public facing way to disaggregate data by Asian American and NHPI subgroup, and making sure that that data is used and put into action by policymakers to target funds and target programming to students who need it. Passing Cal Grant equity that will increase the financial assistance for students across the board and provide Cal Grants to thousands of Asian American and NHPI students who seek to fund their education. Making sure that our governing boards, the UC Regents, the Cal State Board of Trustees, and the Community College Board of Governors are representative of their populations and of the state's diversity by appointing a diverse set of leaders to those bodies. Expanding eligibility under the master plan to make sure that the growing body of students who are graduating from our high schools are meeting the requirements and the eligibility requirements to attend a Cal State or a UC have the ability to do so, and that the campuses have the capacity to enroll them. And finally, supporting Nhpis, both with direct funding for programs that support Asian American and NHPI students, as well as with logistical help, helping campuses identify grant opportunities, coordinating grant opportunities among campuses and potentially within districts, and making sure that campuses and districts are aware of opportunities that exist for them outside of state funding constraints. Finally, at a federal level, expanding DACA and ensuring that more students who are on DACA have Pell Grant access, ensuring that more students have access to DACA and more residents in the United States have access to DACA is something that we believe has to happen on a federal level. Further funding for Nhpis is another step that we believe the federal government needs to take, and also clarifying funding opportunities for minority serving institutions in general, as well as releasing certain restrictions. We know that there are restrictions in place that the campuses, I beg your pardon, are able to apply for multiple grants within the MSI framework. Again, clarification around how that can happen, as well as removal of the final restrictions that do exist, are easy steps we believe can be taken. And finally, disaggregating the data. As noted, major federal sources of education data disaggregate only as far as Asian American and NHPI subgroups. We believe that the federal government needs to address this by creating a data system or collecting data from campuses that includes finer grained and further tuned data on Asian American and NHPI subgroups to ensure that leaders in state and federal level have the information they need to make informed decisions. With that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Michelle Siqueiros, who is going to lead us on a discussion of these recommendations, the report findings, other important findings and recommendations that I haven't included here in my presentation with a group of California luminaries and experts. Michelle.
Thank you, Vikash, and thank you, Doug, for your incredible work in this report. I get to do the really great fun part of introducing our stellar panel of experts. I want to remind everyone that is on here today to please go ahead and ask your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible. I'm going to do really brief introductions to 4 incredible leaders in California that need no introduction. I'm going to start with Crystal Reyes, who is a current Cal State University student trustee. She is a Filipina first-generation college student. She's majoring in computer science and business at Cal State Bakersfield. She's been a student leader and activist ever since she entered college. And for all of our policymaker friends that are listening in, she hopes to work in Sacramento as a DC, in Sacramento or in DC as a policy analyst. So you heard it here first. She would be amazing to have on any member's team. I'd also am thrilled that we have Karthik Ramakrishnan. He's chair of the California Commission on APIA Affairs. He's also a professor of public policy at the University of California at Riverside and executive director of California 100. He founded the Center for Innovation at UC Riverside and AAPI Data. You've probably seen him on CNN or one of the national news shows talking about the importance of Asian Americans, their contributions, where they stand on voting issues and otherwise. He currently chairs the California Commission on APIA Affairs, and he also serves on the U.S. Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee. I'm proud that he's part of our own advisory council here at the campaign and a good friend. I also am thrilled that Steve No, a California Student Aid Commissioner, former trustee for San Francisco City College District, is also joining us. He's a partner at Lozano Smith LLP. He's a member of the Asian American Bar Association in the Greater Bay Area, part of the Board of Governors of the Alumni Association of UC Hastings College of Law, and in honor of his mom, founded the FAM Fund at the Asian Women's Shelter to empower domestic violence survivors. He's also a first-generation college graduate and lawyer. So thrilled that you could join us, Steve. It's been a while since we've been able to connect. And last but definitely not least, Hildy Aguinaldo. She is a California Community College Board of Governors member. She serves as director and corporate counsel for DaVita Inc. She's got an expansive career in the health industry. She has served Governor Brown and Governor Newsom's administration as an appointee in various positions, including her current appointment as Board of Governor member. She's been a longtime advocate and leader in the Filipino American community. So Hildy, thank you so much, all 4 of you, for joining us today. Thrilled to have you. And my first question is, we've heard a lot of really important data, including, really good news, right? In many categories, Asian Americans are excelling, they're going to college, they're graduating. But we also see that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders have much lower rates of both college going and completion, more limited access to A through G courses, with which Vikash discussed, lower transfer rates, right, from community college to our universities. The first question we have for you, and the first question that was put in the chat here, is what can colleges and universities do better to serve and target support to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students? Karthik, I'd like to start with you and then hear from Hildy and Crystal.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and just honored to be on this distinguished panel with all these other amazing leaders. And thank you so much, first of all, for this timely, detailed report that really shines a light on the nuances within our community that often get overlooked, and really have important calls to action. In addition to the data and findings in the report, the recommendations at the end, I think, are just so essential. And I love the fact that it's not only pointing to say what a higher ed institution can do, but also something for state policymakers as well as national policymakers to do. In terms of Pacific Islander, but I would also say important Southeast Asian populations that are also underserved. There are several, several things that we need to do. First of all, we need to have much better collection of data. Thanks to Vikash, Doug, and everyone else on your team to really push hard to get these institutions and systems to provide better data. It shouldn't take that. It shouldn't take the kind of persistent shoe leather work, if you will, to hunt down that data and to get it to get it done. One of the recommendations you have in there is with this cradle to career system, let's make sure as we build out that system that we have the kind of detailed information by race and by detailed origin so that we can understand our communities better throughout that cycle, if you will, right from cradle to career. Part of it is just improving awareness. There's still so many leaders in our higher education systems that don't understand that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander is a separate racial category than Asian. So first of all, just understanding at that level of disaggregation. Also understanding that the challenges that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities face. I say this with a bit of caution because I'm an Asian American, I'm not a Pacific Islander. We try to be as strong allies to Pacific Islander communities as we can. A report that we had done with the James Irvine Foundation found a high proportion of Pacific Islanders that are working in the gig economy, living in crowded households, multi-generational households, and just really struggling in many ways. So imagine what it's like to get into college and to complete college in a timely fashion when you're juggling so much. Pacific Islander communities were also among those with the highest mortality rates from COVID in California. And that's something that a lot of data sets, because they don't include those communities, didn't incorporate their needs and experiences. Similarly, Hmong communities, Cambodian, Lao communities, other Southeast Asian refugee communities have multiple challenges, not only in terms of their parents' socioeconomic status, but the trauma, and including intergenerational trauma that comes from war, wartime experiences, as well as limited access in terms of language proficiency. And that's something, again, a lot of people have stereotypes in terms of the only communities needing language assistance in California are Spanish-speaking populations. Absolutely not true. So to the extent that we're engaging parents, elders, and even students in this work, we need to make sure that we have language access, culturally competent delivery of services, including the recommendation you have for Nhpi's. It's an acronym. It's one of the things you should know about our community. We are awash in acronyms. Read the report to read what Nhpi means, and it means that colleges and universities that are serving Asian American and Pacific Islander student populations need the kind of support, including supplementary support from the state, in order to understand these populations better and to serve them better.
Thank you, Karthik. Hildy, you saw the data in the report on community colleges, obviously the most important public higher ed system for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. Most Asian Americans that start higher ed in California go to a community college. You're on the Board of Governors. What are your thoughts about what can be done to better serve and target support for students?
Well, first, thank you very much to the campaign for putting this panel discussion together. It is an absolute honor to be in this conversation with the campaign and with so many of my distinguished panelists and folks who are on this webinar as well. I have to say that while now is a great time to have this discussion, we are in many respects long overdue to talk about advancing equity in the AA-NHPI community. And the fact that we still have to talk about data disaggregation is a case in point for that. So I know that Karthik and even you, Michelle, had talked about this, but supporting cradle to career data is the key to driving meaningful action with this data-informed decisions. And I'm glad to to see that initiative reaching key milestones already. Michelle, you said in your introduction, you can't solve problems without good data, and I can't say it any better. Second, we need to support the development of peer-to-peer organizations, and NHPI students need to be involved in student government, and I'd love to see the formation of an API student caucus. I realize that outreach is key here given the numbers and the stigma around getting involved. I recall members of my own family telling me that politics, even student politics, was not a place for someone like me. And I worked very hard over the course of my entire career to dispel that myth, and I hope that others know that they are in good company by doing the same. I'm elated to see Layla talking about MANA, and I'm joined here with Crystal serving in such an important leadership role, and hope that she can continue trailblazing as our community college student board members have as well. And it's an absolute honor to serve alongside such great leaders. And third, we can support basic needs, particularly mental health for NHPI students. I think back to the model minority myth where suppression of one's voice was actually favored. I think about the forever foreigner attitude where generations of NHPI people will always feel like second-class citizens. And I hope that every NHPI student feels seen and heard and belonging. And we have to be intentional around making that happen. So again, thank you very much to the campaign and to all of you for providing a forum for this discussion.
Hildy, thank you so much. And thank you for not listening to thoughts of not engaging in student activism. Crystal, we are grateful that you also have championed as student leader. What are your thoughts on how we can better support students?
Thank you, Michelle, for the question. And again, thank you to the campaign for making such a wonderful webinar. I always say that the campaign makes the best research and the most beautiful reports. So really kudos to the report. I have a few recommendations, but I also just want to echo, I think the communities in the AAPI community have been screaming for years that we are all different and that we all have different needs. And so it is absolutely critical that we realize that Asian American isn't a monolith and that there are so many dimensions to consider when we're talking about their engagement in the political system. But today we're talking about higher education. And so that's all obviously the first thing that we need to address and emphasize. And I believe all the speakers here have said that. Second, targeted success programs like MANA, like our speaker Layla mentioned earlier today, can really do a lot for students' educational success, and especially targeted success. And people that would be involved with that would go into the next thing that I would highly recommend for universities to do is to support and retain more faculty and staff of color, specifically Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander faculty of color. And I believe that is also a recommendation in the report. The reason why this is so important is because we want the students who especially don't see themselves in higher education, if they go into a class and they identify with the professor, and I know this from my own experience that I actually had although I'm not Korean American, I had a Korean American mentor in high school that told me that despite my circumstances, she went through something similar, and you can go to higher education to, make your life better, to do something with your life. And so I highly believe that having mentors like that, supporting them, is really key for our students who may feel lost and may feel that they don't belong, especially our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students. Next would be targeting enrollment goals and graduation goals for these students, much like how we see universities across California do targeted outreach to high schools, even across the nation, to increase their enrollment and graduation of Black students. I believe we can also do that for Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian students. And that's really at a campus level, and that's really intentional. But that also, again, starts from disaggregating the data and realizing that, hey, that there is a really big gap in enrolling and attaining the degree for our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. You've all given such incredible solutions, the importance of data, disaggregation, creating a sense of belonging, addressing basic needs, targeting supports to particular groups, increasing faculty diversity and representation, the role of mentors, Crystal. I know that was important for me as a first-gen Latina in higher ed, and then targeted outreach and engagement. Steve, what would you add to that list, and talk in the context of your role in Cal Grant, right? And access to financial aid being so critical for students. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Michelle. You know, I think that the question or issue around Cal Grant raises or touches upon so many discussion points that have been brought to bear in this forum. What's on the table now before the state legislature and the governor is AB 1746, which is an equity framework around Cal Grants, and it's designed really to target the most marginalized communities in the state, especially within the Nhpi community. So I think that's something that we need to pay attention to. The problem with, as you all know, the problem with financial aid and accessing financial aid is just the bureaucracy. It's filling out a FAFSA, it's filling out a GMAT application. And we heard today the language barriers facing so many of our folks. And what AB 1746 will do is we'll streamline the Cal Grant process to make it more accessible to folks, and it will align our Cal Grant system with the FAFSA application, which is already, difficult to manage. We know it's going to be simplified, but anything we can do to lower the barriers for our communities, especially limited English proficient and low income communities, so critical. And beyond that, right, with AB 1746, we're talking about targeting financial aid to the communities that need it most. We talked about poverty levels in our communities highlighted by the report. AB 1746 will expand financial aid to 190,000 students. It's going to cost about $315 million to do, but that is generational change. It's going to affect families across generations and at the cost of about 2% of our state prison budget. I think it's a worthy investment, and programs like this, platforming issues like this is so important to make sure that we look at equity and financial aid policy in a broader way that involves many more communities than are assumed to help build meaningful reform for everyone that needs it.
Thank you, Steve. And as strong supporters of AB 1746, we certainly agree. My next question for you is, one of the unique challenges facing Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students and the community at large is the huge dramatic increase in hate crimes. We've seen over the last 2 years, from 2019 to 2020, we saw anti-Asian hate crimes grow by shocking 420%. And we suspect that that's underreporting of what is actually happening. Crystal, you talked about the importance of belonging. This is a higher education report, but we are not without being in this full environment of what's happening in terms of poverty and anti-Asian hate and the challenges faced by the community at large. So what would you say institutions can do, Crystal, to really support their students and dig deeper into that sense of belonging? Layla gave us a great example, right, by talking about Mana. And then I'll go to Karthik.
Thank you, Michelle. That's such an important question, especially after just the terror that our community has felt and almost hopelessness. That I know I personally felt that, especially after the shooting, I believe, in New Orleans of last year. And one of the most important things to support our students in this time, and Hildy mentioned it a little bit about basic needs. Specifically under the realm of basic needs, I think we need to focus on mental health counselors, the availability of them. So how many do we have on campuses so that they are available to students in general, not just AAPI students, but also counselors that are Nhpi or counselors that are just culturally competent in the issues that our communities face, because it could, today it could be Asian hate crimes, but internally, a lot of our Asian communities go through, especially women, go through abusive situations, sexism, racism. And so there's a lot of things growing up Asian in America that puts onto your psyche, and that affects your attainment in college. Another thing is to ensure that cultural centers on every campuses for Asian Americans are there, and that they're well funded. I had the opportunity to visit all 23 campuses for the CSU system, and some CSUs have beautiful centers with big windows and nice artwork and wonderful funding for programs, and other campuses have smaller cultural centers, no cultural center. Sometimes they're in a closet, kind of smells in there. It's an old building. And so, what does that say to our students when they walk in? Are we welcome in the space? Do we deserve this physical space? And so I think that's so important to have cultural centers. In addition, when it comes to anti-hate crimes, I think it's really important for our cultural centers or our Asian American clubs to put on events. Not only that, to educate, but to interface with other groups, other cultural groups, so that there is an education about what our community does and is, and help break down some of the stigmas and internalized and unconscious biases that may exist on a campus within students. Thank you, Michelle, for the question.
Thanks, Crystal. Really appreciate you. Karthik, what else would you add to this? I know you have analyzed the huge increase in anti-Asian hate, so would welcome your thoughts there. And then maybe just throwing in another question too. Why do you think there's so much resistance to disaggregating data and really analyzing it more properly for this community?
Happy to. Yeah, first, Crystal, I love the ground truth thing that you did, right? It's not just about whether a center exists, but actually visiting and seeing what it looks like. Amazing work. And I wonder if there are ways that we could, Michelle, I'm just wondering, with all of the allies and partners you have throughout the higher ed system that the campaign has, if there are ways to get some of that kind of qualitative and timely data in terms of what something looks like on paper versus what it actually looks like on the ground. That's just incredible. In terms of the increase in hate crimes and hate incidents, and I want to give a shout out to the API Legislative Caucus coalition of over 150 Asian American and Pacific Islander serving organizations, including Stop API Hate, as well as our commission. I was pleased to see in the report and the quotes from leaders, our executive director, as well as commissioners being quoted, and I know that they helped inform the report as well as Senator Pan, who's the chair of the caucus. We passed an API equity budget that took special note of the increase in hate and hate incidents, and working with California Department of Social Services, as well as other state agencies, to make sure that we better understand and provide services to these communities. Our higher education systems were not part of that equity budget, and I think that can and should be part of the unfinished agenda for this work. Importantly, when we look at the increase in hate incidents, yes, it is true that Asian Americans saw the biggest increases, but Pacific Islander communities also have seen significant incidents of hate. And remember, they are a different racial group than Asian Americans. We also saw significant hate incidents involving Black populations and multiracial populations. A lot of people think, and by the way, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have high proportion of multiracial, self-identified multiracial folks. A lot of people think, oh, we're like entering into this post-racial reality with multiracial students and populations, that is simply not true. And in fact, the highest incident of hate that we saw in our survey research with Momentive in 2021 and 2022 was among multiracial populations. So we need to pay specific attention there in terms of what's going on. In terms of why disaggregation is important, and in the chat and the Q&A, there were some questions in terms of how do we define Asian and Pacific Islander. Are Filipinos Asian or Pacific Islander? They're considered Asian by the US Census Bureau, by all federal agencies, and that filters down to state agencies as well. In terms of Middle Eastern students, there was that question. Asian is not a geographic category, it's a racial category. I have a paper with Jennifer Lee, who's a professor at Columbia, called Who Counts as Asian? And if you trace back the history, who counts as Asian is exclusion from whiteness. You had a light-skinned Japanese American who took a case to the Supreme Court saying that I should count as white because I'm lighter skinned than many Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. And the court said, no, you're not white because Caucasian is what counts for white. The next year you had a South Asian who was actually mistakenly granted citizenship. This is in the 1920s, saying that some of the dominant racial theories say that I'm Caucasian, therefore I should be granted citizenship. And the Supreme Court says, no, we mean white Caucasian when we say white. And so that it goes that deep, right? So at that point, if you were Middle Eastern, you were not excluded from US citizenship, but you were excluded from US citizenship until the 1940s and really until 1952, if you did not count as white. Disaggregation is so important to that last question you had, Michelle, because we can, if we want to have effective targeted solutions, having this catch-all category of Asian or even of Pacific Islander, there are differences among Pacific Islanders between Native Hawaiians and Tongans and Samoans in terms of outcomes that we can see from American Community Survey data, as well as the data that you analyze, that your team analyzed. If we do not have a targeted understanding, how can we expect our solutions to be effective? Those solutions will not be effective, partly because of language access and culturally competent delivery of care. But even this notion that many of these speakers of other speakers have talked about in terms of being recognized, being seen, being respected, that's an important part of people's lived experiences and all of the challenges and opportunities that they faced. And I think not only was this important for solutions, but thinking about the next generation of mentors, it's going to be so critical to be able to recognize people for their complete selves, including their multiracial selves, in order to provide that kind of assistance moving forward.
Thank you so much, Karthik. Hildy, what would you add to that? And then I want to pass it to Vin to answer one of the questions in the chat about affirmative action.
I don't have anything to add. I think you guys said it beautifully.
So much gold here. So Vin, thanks for coming on. We have a question from Eunice in the chat. She says, when we talk about minority students, we talk a lot about Black, Brown, and Native American students. I don't really hear Asian students as a minority group to be given affirmative action. Instead, they are widely considered white adjacent. Should there be a wider effort to group Asian students with Black, Brown, and Native Americans? So lots to unpack there. Vincent, as co-director of Chinese for Affirmative Action and as part of the ballot measure committee for the Yes on Prop 16 campaign, I'd love for you to tackle that one.
Sure, I'm happy to. And I think all the comments actually that the panelists and the speakers that made really underscore why we do need to have affirmative action, which is essentially policies that are race conscious and gender conscious, that lift up the different needs that we have so that we can create programs that actually address those different needs. Of course, we can think about the different ways that we need to come together through difference. But we're not able to do that when we pretend that there are no differences. Now, affirmative action looks different in different settings, but I think overall there's much more in common with other communities of color for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians in terms of the general approach, right? And so, I think one of the things that screams out from this report in particular are the realities that when you disaggregate the data, just how wide-ranging the needs are, and that you're not going to address those problems by a one-size-fits-all approach, whether for the Asian American community or for other communities of color. And then also the different ways that we also know that gender, as speakers have brought up, that gender plays a role, that immigration status plays a role. So, ultimately, I think like affirmative action is just a willingness to take our head out of the sand and see really clearly what's happening. And so, I think there's a lot of work to do in our community to help communicate that. But whether it's hate incidents or lack of educational opportunity, health disparities, all that calls for smart public policy that's based in being able to see clearly the challenges that we have.
Thank you, Vin. And then the last question before we close. Steve, the governor has proposed a 70% college attainment goal. We have long championed the need to be much more intentional and targeted, not only about how do we ensure more Californians go to college, but how do we ensure that there's true equity in that college going, right? By race, ethnicity, gender, et cetera. What are your thoughts about this plan and how we can do better and maybe institute some of the very good solutions, right, that have been both presented in the report and have been shared by our panelists? Any thoughts that you want to add to that?
I think that question is a nice catch-all question, Michelle, for everything that we talked about today, right? Just to build on Vincent's point, no, our community is not different. Our various communities aren't different. Our state and nation is not different. We tell ourselves stories. It's how we govern. It's how we practice law. That's what we do. And when you disaggregate data, you actually have to think about maybe whether the story is a little different. And then why it's hard to disaggregate data as a political question is unusual, but not, because it does disrupt those stories. It calls the question on policy and politics, and it requires further action. And sometimes it requires sacrifice and negotiation among folks that maybe did not assume or did not expect to give anything on some of these policy questions, and to maybe lose attachment to stories that we've been telling ourselves about the model minority myth and how well Asian community is doing, because it is disruptive and it requires us to engage. That's true across financial aid, and it's true across, of course, at the local level with school boards and college boards, where a lot of meaningful curriculum reforms that I know the campaign's been championing that will make it easier for our students to get through college, to reach their aspirations, whether it be through financial aid or curriculum reform. Those are questions that are called upon us, students, as well as policymakers and leaders, to engage. And it does require our community to step up and take hold of this information and say, hey, we're here too. We need some services. We need the way we educate our kids to change. We need the way we finance our education to change. And that takes a lot of work, but it certainly begins with a platform like this and a conversation like this and a report like this. So I want to thank you for all your work and leadership on this very important, very range of important matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Hildy, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think that educational attainment goal is part of the governor's historic budget investment of $39.6 billion. And I think about how the report laid out very clearly that the community colleges are the largest enroller of our students in the state, and how our California college, community college system educated 70% of California's first responders on the front lines of the pandemic. I think about how the California Community Colleges is a driver of the state's economy and generates $128.2 billion worth of economic activity, and know that any investment in that regard will have incredible long-lasting returns. So I think that the investment in general allows us to get very granular in the way that we think about closing gaps and achieving these goals. It allows us to address pivotal questions that may be posing barriers to our students and even to our faculty and staff. For example, are our students place-bound and tied geographically to the schools they could transfer into? How are issues of being a first, 1.5, or second generation immigrant playing into attainment? How are the needs of undocumented students being addressed? And I saw that question posed in the chat as well. How are we thinking about workforce development and professional development? And do we have stakeholders at all levels of decision-making representing our community? Overall, I think it's great that this investment allows us to get to this advantageous place where we have more questions than answers. And hopefully the data that we collect via all this data disaggregation will help us figure all this out.
Thank you, Hildy. Karthik?
So much, so many amazing insights. I'll just say, just double click on all of them. I love the part about storytelling, right? And the kind of disrupting the kind of narratives that we have in the foreword. And thank you, campaign, for the invitation to write the foreword. Spoke a little bit about that DNA framework that we have, data, narrative, and action. Would you have laid out what the campaign has laid out, compelling data points and calls to action? Community narratives have always been there, but policymakers don't always listen. Institutional leaders don't always listen. I am hopeful that this will be a kind of blueprint of recommendations, and the calls to action will be taken seriously by institutional leaders and policy leaders. The kinds of solutions that this report calls for are the kinds of systemic fixes that will not only benefit Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students, but will benefit a much wider set of communities. So really kudos for working so hard on the report, but the important work that underlied getting to this point. I hope that we're at the end of an HPI Heritage Month, that this is not the end, but really the beginning of the important work that needs to be done. Our commission looks forward to working with you and your team. I know we've already worked with you, and I'm hoping that the legislature and the governor's office will as well.
Thank you, Karthik. I think that's a perfect segue. While today might be the last day of a month-long celebration of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander heritage to this nation, that really the work that we've elevated in this report is work that needs to happen every single day, right? And every day is a day that we should celebrate the many contributions. As Vikash noted recently when we were chatting about this report, it is just shy of the length of his dissertation that he earned from Columbia. I do urge all of you to download this report. I'm gonna just say that I know your dissertation was really interesting, but I do think that this one was incredible. So thank you, Doug, for the work that you did compiling all of the data. It gives you an insight into real important data and facts, and we get to celebrate a lot of really good news in this report. And then we also get the sobering reality that that it's not, when we bundle Asian Americans, that has been a strategy for unity in ways that have been helpful and positive, but that also can be challenging if we do ignore that really across the experience, there's real inequity, right? Depending on where students come from, their migration history. One of the things I loved about this report is that we do get into a little bit of historical context, right? And I think we all need reminding every day that, from the gold mines to the railroads to the Central Valley food basket, to the Tech Center of Silicon Valley, the contributions of Asian Americans building literally California is what has happened. And we owe it to our ancestors and those that fought so very hard to make sure that we address the disparities that persist and that we support this work moving forward. So we encourage you to download the full report. There is a shorter executive summary. We encourage you to share it with your policymakers. You know, there are very clear strategies that high schools can be taking on in order to support our students, as well as each of our campuses and universities. And you know that the campaign will continue to fight for stronger data disaggregation in California, and ensuring that we are much more intentional about supporting all of our students. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your good leadership and work. Crystal, super grateful for everything that you're doing and can't wait to see what else you do next. So with that, I hope you all have a great week.